It's done. I just wanted to, wake everybody up. So good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I haven't done this before. So welcome to our meeting of the Kiwanis Club of Downtown Madison on October 24th. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag in the back. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So we've got some nice things going on. The weather's nice. The Badgers won. Bad news is the Packers lost. But the best news, I know for some of our members, is that the Wisconsin State Journal decided to bring back the crypto quote. So, yay. The crypto quote. Crypto quote has been in the paper. I started doing it in '68. So. Oh, is it not on? Where's the switch? Oh, it's turned, I think. Is it this? Yeah. Okay. That better? Yeah. Speak up. I'll just talk loud right now. Rich is working on that. So we're going to begin with our program with our guest speaker, who is Doug Moe, who's going to speak on his book, Hit Saunders Nordine, and the rise of women's intercollegiate athletics at the University of Wisconsin and beyond. And Terry Shockley is going to do the introduction.
Well, if our old friend Tony Brewster was here today, he would do an on Wisconsin after that victory over the dreaded Purdue Boilermakers on Saturday. So it is indeed time for celebration in that regard. Let me just say at the beginning of things I'm not going to say about Doug Moe. First of all, I'm not going to tell any of his schoolboy stories. And I certainly am not going to tell any of the many stories that his father told me about him. And at one point in time, we played a little golf. And, I think he became relatively proficient at the game, although I don't know about the current golf game of Doug Moe, so I won't speak to that. A little bit about the background of why I'm introducing Doug and why I know him. In 1966, I came to Madison, and at the invite of his father, Tony Moe, who was at the time the head of Channel 27 and Mid-Continent Broadcasting. What was remarkable about that period of time at Channel 27 and Mid-Continent is that in the building, there were three Hall of Fame broadcasters. Doug's father, Tony Moe, his right-hand guy, Ben Hovel, and the radio guy, Raj Russell. So I want to tell you something. That was an education in itself for a young guy coming in as the former news and sports director in Fairfield, Iowa, after he got his master's degree in radio, TV, film, to come in and meet with these sages of the business. Tony, the father, in about 1970-71, left for the ECB, the State Educational Communications Board, where he headed that up. That was for all of the statewide television stations. And I was fortunate enough to be selected as first the executive vice president, later the president of the Wisconsin TV network. But during that period of time where I was in with those Hall of Famers, and I wore my Hall of Fame ring today from the Wisconsin broadcasters, only in tribute to those three men, because I'll tell you this, I wouldn't have it on my finger had it not been for those three individuals, Tony Moe, Ben Hovel, Raj Russell. Extremely, extremely great men. So what was unique about it is that on Saturday mornings, I figured out that Tony, his dad, always came into this television station and worked a little while. So I made it a point of coming in. And we would go down to the Renabaum's drugstore. You remember Renabaum's? Well, we would go down to Renabaum's in Westgate, and we'd have a brownie a la mode, without fail, a brownie a la mode. And we would talk about the industry. And Tony was not only steeped in the kind of the history of the business, but he was also very familiar with the network patterns of all three networks at the time. Fox wasn't around at that point. And he particularly was very well acquainted with CBS, where he had worked, and then he was obviously very familiar with ABC. So the lessons I learned at Renabaum's drugstore on a Saturday morning gave me my PhD in the radio TV business, without a doubt. So while all that was going on, this fellow I'm going to introduce to you today, Doug Moe, was honing his skills as a journalist and an author. And from those early times to now, he's written thousands of articles and magazine stories, literally thousands. In fact, he has been voted 12 times, maybe more now, but the last I knew, about 12 times as Madison's best columnist. He's also been recognized by the State Bar Association for the Golden Gavel, pretty prestigious award in itself. And he's been recognized twice for that I know of. You know, his skills go far beyond just the columns that he writes, but now the books that he writes. And he has a whole laundry list of books that he's written. I have many of them, and they're all enjoyable reading. They're all insightful, and there's some really interesting things. I think he's interviewed Stalin's daughter, matter of fact, at some point in his deep history. So this is a fellow that I consider to be one of the real stars in Madison. A quiet star in Madison, but a real star. And so it's my great pleasure today to introduce Doug, who's going to talk about his new book, The Right Thing to Do. And it's all about Kit Saunders, Nordine. And again, I have an association there in that Dale lent me my first dollar to buy my first home when he was at First Federal. And Kit Saunders invited Sandy to be on her women's athletic board and advisory board. And we ended up doing, on our radio station, we ended up doing a women's sports show for Badger Women's Athletics. So a lot of ties for me, and a great feeling to be able to introduce one of Madison's real stars, Doug Moe.
Thanks, folks. Thank you, Terry, especially. You know, I started working on The Right Thing to Do several years ago.
More volume, please.
I started working on The Right Thing to Do.
Yeah, it's just not on. It just needs to be turned up.
Go ahead.
I started working on the book several years ago, but it was only like last year, and I was coming close to finishing, and it dawned on me that if I did finish and we got it out published this year, it would be the 50th anniversary year of Title IX being enacted into law in 1972. So I hustled, and the publisher did a good job, and we brought it out in the a few months back, and indeed the 50th anniversary. And Title IX is, although the book's a biography of Kit Saunders Nordine, Title IX is a through line throughout the book. Those 37 words, part of the Education Amendments Act of 1972, forbid discrimination on the basis of sex for any institution or any activity. That sounds pretty good. Yeah. Forbid discrimination for any activity that received federal funding. It was and remains of huge importance to women's intercollegiate athletics, but it was not a panacea. It faced resistance and legal challenges from the start. It took time to implement. There's a famous episode in UW women's athletics history, an episode in which the women's crew team changed clothes from their street clothes to their practice clothes outside Elroy Hirsch's office. He was the men's athletic director at the time. They called the media, of course. They didn't have a locker room. Now, this was 1979, which of course is 7 years after Title IX was passed. Back in 1972, when Kit Saunders first heard about Title IX, she recalled saying, "Oh boy, somebody finally did something. This is probably going to help us." Kit was then, in 1972, running the women's club sports program at UW. There were no varsity sports.
That's what it is.
No one, okay. Yeah, believe me. There were no varsity sports in '72 when Kit was running the club sports program. She arrived in Madison in 1964 from grad school from her native New Jersey. And I should note that when Kit's husband, who Terry referenced, Dale Buzz Nordine, approached me about doing this book, Kit was alive, but severely ill with Alzheimer's. And so she was unable to be interviewed. However, I was lucky in the sense that she had given 2 lengthy interviews to the University of Wisconsin Oral History Program, which is a marvelous resource for journalists, historians, or just the general public. They have probably 1,500 or so individuals that they've interviewed. So it was like I almost could interview Kit in that sense, and that was very helpful to me, of course. Both Kit and Buzz died in the few years I was researching and writing the book. Nordine family remained steadfast in wanting to publish, and I really appreciate that. Kit was an excellent athlete out in Teaneck as a girl. I interviewed a gentleman named Art Brown, her 6th grade classmate, class of 1952, who said, quote, "I chose her first if given the chance, even before any of the boys, for playground games of any kind." But like other girls who hoped to play sports, Kit was frustrated growing up in the 40s and 50s. Sports for girls consisted of play days. Kit described them like this: you could get together with another school, but we had teams named Donald Duck, Snoopy, or whatever. People were all mixed up, so you couldn't get in a real competitive spirit against another school. Ironically, given that Kit ended up in Madison, the person most responsible for keeping girls and young women from serious athletic competition was a woman by the name of Blanche Trilling, who from 1912 to 1946 was director of women's physical education at UW-Madison and a big leader nationally in women's phy ed. Trilling's motto was "a sport for every girl and a girl in every sport." She valued participation, but she was against competition for girls and women, saying, "I positively do not approve of competition for women and the undue emphasis that is placed on individual accomplishment and the winning of championships."
I think I just turn it off. It'll work. Yep, just turn it on and off right now. Let me- Go ahead.
All right. Kit much later said, it was like, why couldn't we possibly have both? Encourage participation, but also encourage the elite women athletes, give them their chance to be elite, to compete. It was as if we couldn't do both somehow. Trilling was gone, but that mindset remained when Kit got to Madison in 1964 to study for a master's in Phi Ed. She eventually earned a PhD. I interviewed Nancy Page, who was a contemporary of Kit's in Madison in the 60s, and later a Hall of Fame women's coach at UW Stevens Point. Page said they'd once organized a basketball game in Lathrop Hall, which is where the women's Phi Ed was on campus, against a team of women from Northern Illinois University. When the head of women's Phi Ed in Madison found out, Page said, quote, "We were called into her office and read the riot act for playing a basketball game." Things did slowly start to change, but the key word is slowly. Kit was named director of the club sports program for women, as I mentioned. Her budget in 1971 was $2,000. Kit described it like this: "We had no priority on facilities."
New batteries.
Thank you. "We had no priority on facilities. We had very limited uniforms. We had 11 teams, and on a weekend, we'd have to try to launder the uniforms and get them quickly to the next team." When Title IX became law in 1972, UW Chancellor Ed Young formed a committee to see how athletics on campus could be made more equitable. Unfortunately, Young chose men's athletic director Elroy Hirsch, made him chairman of the committee. It met once in 8 months. You know, in Elroy's defense, the passage of Title IX did not magically bring a lot more money in. So they were faced with trying to accomplish all this equity in all these other sports without any additional funding, really. So it wasn't easy. Elroy was eventually replaced by a professor named Murray Fowler, and the committee did start meeting regularly. And the result was that in 1974, women's athletics at UW gained varsity status, and Kit Saunders was named the first director of women's athletics on July 1, 1974. Kit later recalled that at a press conference announcing her appointment, afterwards, the sports editor of the State Journal said he had a word of advice for her. "What's that?" Kit said. "Don't be a bitch." Soon after, when Tamara Flareup was hired as Kit's first women's sports information director, and Tam ended up staying 40 years, that same sports editor had a word for Tam as well. "I will never have women's sports in my sports pages." The arrival of Flareup, and around the same time Paula Bonner as Kit's top assistant, set the team that would propel UW women's sports forward in the early years. That State Journal sports editor retired. Bill Brophy came on and was much more open to covering women's sports. As Terry mentioned, Whist Club, the Booster Club was founded, and they got a radio show. The town at large, I think, began to warm up to women's sports. There was success in competition for UW, national championships in crew and cross country. Volleyball was ascendant in the 1980s, led by a charismatic coach named Steve Lowe. The Badgers hosted a first-round NCAA volleyball tournament match in 1990 at the Fieldhouse. Kit and Tam Flareup sat in the top balcony and watched as nearly 11,000 fans packed the Fieldhouse for the women's match. Nowadays, that's not so unusual for women's volleyball, but at the time, you can imagine, Tam told me that she and Kit had tears running down their face watching that happen. You know, one of the pleasures of doing the book for me was being able to interview about between 25 and 30 former women athletes and coaches. Almost always, without exception, they were excited to relive those days. You know, they talked about the hardships, and there were hardships. They traveled in old cars and vans, practiced at odd hours. But they also said that was all they knew. And, you know, they wanted to play. They wanted to compete. One whose story was particularly interesting was a Madison girl named Karen Lunda. She played soccer and softball at Madison West, but when she came to the UW in the late 1970s, there was no women's soccer or softball team. Instead, Lunda played varsity field hockey, while starting a club sport for soccer on campus. Once for a soccer club sport tournament in Indianapolis, Lunda's UW team wanted to play but had no way to get there. Someone had a van, but it was missing its front seat. So Karen told me, we literally duct taped the lawn chair to the front of the van and we all piled in. We just wanted to play. In Lunda's senior year of 1981, UW dropped field hockey as a varsity sport and introduced soccer as a varsity sport for women. While Karen felt poorly for her field hockey teammates, she was elated to be able to play varsity soccer. And boy, she made the most of it. She led the Badgers that year in goals, points, and assists. And that one year earned her entry into the UW Athletic Hall of Fame. And in summer 2019, 38 years later, Lunda was watching the Women's World Cup final between the US and the Netherlands with a friend. Lunda told me she had not really been following the tournament closely, so when an American named Rose Lavelle scored a goal to seal a 2-0 win for the Americans, her friend did a Google search on Lavelle. And that's how Karen Lunda learned the World Cup star was a UW Badger, playing the sport that Lunda and her teammates had initiated in Madison 4 decades earlier. That was tremendous, Karen told me. Other athletes I interviewed included Carrie Graves, a rower from Spring Green, who became an Olympic rowing legend. Kit and Carrie were the first 2 inductees into the UW Women's Athletic Hall of Fame in 1984. Carrie is featured and pictured on the cover of a terrific book about the US Women's Olympic rowing team. It's called The Red Rose Crew, and it is really good. I urge you to read it right after you've read mine. Carrie and her teammates gave Kit her first national championship in 1975 at Princeton, New Jersey, the National Women's Rowing Championship. It wasn't an NCAA sport at the time. That final race is one of my favorite parts in the book. Those women didn't believe in themselves until late in the season, but they finally did. And their coach, Jay Minier, told them he'd have a case of beer for them if they won, and he did, Pabst Blue Ribbon. It was 4 years after that national championship when the women's crew had to change their clothes outside of Elroy's office. You know, everyone laughs about that now, but I interviewed the captain of that 1979 team, Jane Ludwig, who said, who said the reaction among the male sports establishment was not amusement. It was a traumatizing experience for me in a way, Jane said. I had alumni calling me, coaches telling me to stop it. My male friends on the team really weren't my friends anymore. 7 years after Title IX. I mentioned earlier that Title IX itself was attacked after it became law. The most significant setback involved a Pennsylvania school called Grove City College. Essentially, the claim was that though some of their students received financial aid, their athletic department did not, and so should not have to follow sex equity regulations. In 1984, the US Supreme Court agreed in a 6-3 decision in favor of Grove City. There was a happy ending. Congress passed a new law saying Title IX applied to both direct and indirect beneficiaries of federal aid. President Reagan vetoed it, but if you can believe it, in these times, Congress, both houses overrode the veto. So Title IX had its teeth back again in 1988. On the Madison campus, only a handful of Title IX complaints were ever filed. One of them was by Edwina Qualls, who was the women's basketball coach in the late 70s and early 80s. Her complaint regarded facilities and inequity in facilities and travel. Qualls was the one person I really wanted to interview for the book, and I just couldn't find her. I had people helping me, and we just couldn't locate her. She had some success as a coach, but her tenure here ended amid great controversy. Some might remember in February of '84, Qualls and the Badgers were playing at Minnesota. And in the second half, Qualls became highly upset with the officiating and told her team to leave the court and return to the locker room. 5 players refused and finished the game. The ensuing controversy was the beginning of the end for Qualls and Madison. Earlier, when I referenced the volleyball tournament match that drew 11,000 fans to the field house in 1990, you'll recall I said it was an NCAA tournament match, and it was. But in the early years after Title IX passed, the NCAA, like much of the male sports establishment, really wanted nothing to do with women's athletics. And that predicted doom for men's programs, actually, if they had to share funding. Consequently, the women established their own organization, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, the AIAW. By 1980, Kit had the position of National Vice President of the AIAW. That was also about the time the women's basketball tournament, AIAW tournament, got a national television contract. All of a sudden, there was some money there. And all of a sudden, the NCAA got interested. By 1982, the AIAW was history usurped by the NCAA. There were some advantages, certainly. NCAA paid travel expenses for teams, which the AIAW didn't. But they also, a lot of schools lost women sports administration leaders when the NCAA took over. I interviewed a woman named Judy Sweet about this. Judy's a Milwaukee native and attended UW-Madison in the late 1960s, where she was mentored by Kit. Under Kit's guidance, Judy in 1968 became president of the National Association of College Women Athletes. Judy went on to be director of both men's and women's athletics at University of California, San Diego. And get this, in 1991, Judy Sweet became the first female president of the NCAA. But she was clear-eyed about the NCAA takeover of the AIAW a decade earlier. It really was an insult, Judy told me, to the AIAW that the NCAA went about it the way they did. It really wasn't a merger, it was a submerger. Judy writes the foreword to my book. You know, and one of the interesting things she said was, no, it's just scratchy. I can, well, okay. You know, and I asked her about being named president of NCAA in 1991. She was obviously honored, but I asked her anything else about it, and she said, yeah, I'm glad there was no social media back then. I said, you know, why? And she said, because you wouldn't believe how many people took the time to write me handwritten letters chastising me for taking a man's job and telling me it was not my place. Kit ended her career at UW as associate athletic director for all non-income sports. She retired in 1990, just age 49. Her legendary track and cross-country coach, Peter Tagan, told me, I think she was exhausted. She fought a battle. She'd also married Buzz by then, and they traveled extensively, spent time at a farm they owned south of Madison, and of course, attended UW sporting events. In retirement, Kit was recipient of numerous Lifetime Achievement Awards, befitting her status as a true pioneer of women's intercollegiate athletics. It was indicative of how far women's athletics had come in Kit's lifetime. Yet it would be unwise, I believe, to ever become complacent. This past winter, I had a chance to interview a young woman named Anna Hoffman, 21, she's from Madison, and she represented the United States in ski jumping at the Winter Olympics in China. I told Anna about Kit in my book and how a contemporary of Kit's, a woman named Becky Sisley, she was a UW grad and was with Kit here in the 1960s. Becky went on to become the first women's athletic director at University of Oregon. And when I interviewed Becky, she was talking about how for the longest time, women weren't allowed to race long distances. And she put it as only Becky Sisley might. She said, it was thought, she said, if they ran and jumped, maybe their uteruses would fall out. Anna Hoffman laughed when I related that to her, but she said, you know, ski jumping has only been an Olympic sport for women since 2014. And by the way, the men have two jumps, a medium jump and a real high jump that they go off, two events in the Olympics. The women only go off the medium jump. Anna said, you know, I've gone off that big jump, that high jump so many times in practice, and here I am, still intact. You know, at the 2021 NCAA men's and women's basketball tournament, the NCAA wound up having to apologize after photos appeared on social media showing a vast disparity between the workout facilities at the men's and women's NCAA basketball tournament. You can guess who had the vastly superior facilities 49 years after Title IX, which should not diminish the importance of Title IX in those 37 words. If it hadn't been for Title IX, Kit once said, we might still be sharing uniforms and scratching the ice off the windows of old fleet cars with our fingernails. Excuse me, in her foreword to my book, Judy Sweet wrote this: on the 50th anniversary of Title IX, we can celebrate the positive changes that have been made, but we know there is more to be done. We must remain vigilant and ensure that our daughters have the same opportunities as our sons. That is one of Kit's legacies that must be honored. So thanks, folks. Thanks for listening to me today. I'm happy to take questions if there's time. Yeah, John. Oh, thank you.
I've got to say, since I came in and didn't talk to anybody, but everyone talked about the demise of the Packers, the success of the Badgers, and nobody said a word about the most exciting athletic event of the weekend. And that was the volleyball team going to Michigan and handing it to them.
Yeah. Well, they won as folks probably know, they won the national championship last year. Yeah.
How is equality measured? Is it the number of sports or the number of athletes? How is it measured?
You know, when Title IX first came on, they gave them several years to sort of digest it and try to figure that out. And it was at that time was health, education, and welfare. And they didn't, and I think this is still true, there was no strict, you know, you got to have 50% athletes, but there had to be, for lack of a better word, I think, proof of a good faith effort to, and, you know, let's face it, here in Madison, you folks probably famously remember the early 90s when they cut sports here.
Baseball.
Part of that, baseball being the most infamous one. And there's no question, part of that was an equity measure. I mean, they cut some women's fencing and some women's got cut as well, but women's softball came on, and it's still a, you know, I think a fluid situation. It's funny, I've done a number of panels since my book came out over the summer, and when I've been on with UW volleyball player and a current basketball player, current swimmer, and they are really happy with their, you know, I think equity, at least on this campus, has come pretty close to being achieved. We also have the older athletes on those panels, and when they tell their stories, these young women are going, you know, looking at them with their mouths agape. But yes, sir.
I wanted to mention to you that our current president, Meg Galloway, who was on the group, and she would, what would you guess she was on, about 1990, right? Well, she's on the group too. She was on the group. Yeah. And so when they had a really good group team, which they had for years, I'm really disappointed that she wasn't able to be here. She's out of state right now. So.
That Brickman was also a rower. And we should remember that the women's hockey team is very, very.
Oh yeah, national championships. Mark Johnson, the coach. Folks might be interested. The book I'm finishing up, not quite finishing, but I've written 200 pages with Mike Leckrone, the band director, on his autobiography. So that's going to be a good one. Yeah, you won't have me to speak. Mike will speak. He's better anyway.
He just had a program with
Yeah.
Overture for 5,
I was there. Yep.
And it was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a showman, 86 years old, and still loves it. Yes, Terry.
Yeah, Doug, recently I spoke to my alma mater's wrestling team, which includes now both men and women. And, you know, the women's wrestling, which people don't realize, is the fastest growing element in the sport. And if you could have seen the smiles on these women's faces who were assembled at match side when I taught, it was really inspirational because they're excited about their opportunity.
Right.
They really are.
Yeah, I love that. Good to hear. Yes, sir.
Who sets the salaries of our University of Wisconsin coaches? And I presume that the women's basketball coach makes a much less than Coach Guard.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Who sets them? Pretty sure my guess is that the athletic director gets a figure and the athletic board has to approve it. Yeah, my wife just turned off the athletic board after 5 years. She really likes Chris McIntosh. On the other hand, Chris' daughter lives next door to us, so it's been an interesting few weeks. Yeah.
I want one of your books. I want one of your.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there. I brought a few. It's $20, cash or check, tax included. I'm happy to.
But I also want to say
Yeah.
that you should be commended for writing this book. Who else to tell a story, the history, and to give inspiration to young people coming up to say, hey, sometimes you got to fight for what you need and what you want. Just an amazing story.
I appreciate that. You know, back in 2015, when I was invited not to return to the Wisconsin State Journal, along with several older folks. I wasn't happy at the time, but as things sometimes do, you know, being able to do these, you know, I collaborated with Governor Thompson on his autobiography. I did a 100-year history of United Way. I did this book, and as I mentioned, I'm doing one with Mike, and I've actually almost finished working with Senator Fred Risser on his autobiography. So if I was writing 5 newspaper columns a week, none of that would have got done. Yeah, I collaborated with. That was a wild time too.
Personal experience. Our daughter was in 5th or 6th grade, and she wanted to play baseball, and there was no women's team, so she played with the guys. And she has gone on to where she is now coaching soccer as an adult, but she's one of those who benefited from Title IX in her college studies.
Super. Yeah.
From my point of view, it would be real interesting to see some type of history of Title IX within high schools. Because I gotta believe there was a lot of blowback, pushback.
Interesting. The New York Times, Sunday New York Times, that's just yesterday, right? They had a long article about a high school in Hawaii that is having a Title IX issue right now. If you do a Google, you know, search on that and just Hawaii high school Title IX, that article will pop up. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, we used to have girls that would compete in wrestling now. I was at the middle school, so I knew the middle school girls competing in wrestling. And many times the boys refused to compete with them. So they won. The girls won.
Yes, sir.
Do all of the women's sports at UW operate at a loss?
I don't think volleyball. I'm not sure it's producing a lot of income, but you know, that was one of the, in the early days of Title IX, they tried to separate the income sports from the non-income in terms of compliance. And that basically would have gutted Title IX. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that there's only 2 or 3 men's sports that are income producing. The rest of those are not income producing. So, yeah.
For those of you who don't think that women are tough, all of us remember Shauna Verstegen, who was a member of this club for a while. I saw her this morning. She was pushing her clients around in a wheelchair doing their physical work. And she said yesterday, I think it was yesterday, she pushed her on a 5K race. And so there's one tough lady, I'll tell you.
Yeah, my wife is now a client of Shauna's, and she'll second that. She has her doing those rope, you know, things. Oh, better her than me. Yeah, and I do, like I said, no expectation, but I do have books here if anyone's interested. And again, thanks for having me today. It was fun.
Thank you, Doug. Terrific. So I don't know if we have anyone scheduled for a moment of reflection today. Eileen, please do.
Yeah. Good thing you came this year.
I'm a fan of trivia because sometimes you get something that will work in a crossword puzzle. Sometimes you can use it in a conversation if things are lagging. And I get an email every day with isn't this interesting? So I picked out a couple to share. Now, Abe said, don't cause any problems. Well, the last one I have, I will poke a stick. So first of all, you might need this in a conversation. Leeches have 32 brains. Humans love to think we're the brainiest species around, but leeches have an impressive 32 brains, making them absolute shoo-ins if Mensa ever expands the ranks to include non-human animals. These blood-sucking invertebrates are biologically divided into around 32 separate sections, which each feature their own brain section. Okay. Lemons float, but limes sink. Few flavors complement each other like lemon and lime, with many a refreshing treat. Combining both gives you a maximum effect. The 2 citrus fruits have some key differences, however, including the fact that limes sink while lemons float. You may have noticed that if you've ever put lime and lemon slices in a glass of water, and the reason is simple. Objects only float if they're less dense than the liquid they're placed in. And while both limes and lemons have densities close to that of water, limes are denser than their yellow counterparts. That remains true whether the lemon or the lime in question is whole, peeled, or sliced. People breathe primarily out of one nostril. Did you know that? You read these too. The human nose is a biological wonder. It can smell up to 1 trillion odors, trap harmful debris in the air before it enters your lungs, and affect your sex life. I didn't explore that. But arguably, its most important job is to condition the air you breathe before the air enters your respiratory tract. This means warming and humidifying the air before it passes to your throat and beyond. To do this, the nose undergoes a nasal cycle, in which one nostril sucks in the majority of the air while the other takes a break. A few hours later, on average, the nostrils switch roles. The cycle is regulated by the body's autonomic nervous system, which swells or deflates erectile tissue, refer back to the other comment, found in the nose. Although we don't notice this throughout the day, if you cover your nostril with your thumb one at a time, you'll likely observe that airflow through one is significantly higher than the other. That's also why one nostril tends to be more congested than the other when you have a cold. So finally, and this is the one where I'm going to skew. We have 3 women in the audience, so this is for you. Autumn heralds, or topic, male squirrels get smarter in the fall. Got that? Autumn heralds the arrival of many things: pumpkin pie, crisp morning air, and apparently more intelligent rodents. Male squirrels get smarter in the fall due to their hippocampus, and that's the part that's involved in memory, increasing in size during the caching season, the time of year when they gather even more nuts than usual. In an especially adorable move, they stuff their snacks in their cheeks before moving their food to a more permanent storage spot. Interestingly, female squirrel brains don't show the same effect. Researchers speculate that male squirrel brains may change in the fall to act more like female brains already are.
I've got no answer for that. I'm sure though, as fall progresses, I will. So announcements. I have an announcement in regard to Wilmar. Anybody else who has an announcement, come on up. We served meals at Wilmar Neighborhood Center on Saturday, and we had hot dogs and buns and potato salad, and we had mixed fruit, and we had a tossed salad. And those who helped out were Abe and Co, Eileen, and Bob Rand. And we served about, what do we decide, Abe, about probably only about 25 people. Everybody had doubles, I think. So we used most of the hot dogs. Any other announcements? Okay. Don't forget to get your books, and we will adjourn for today. Thank you. See you next week.